Hello all, this is Mahesh Panhale, and in this series we are going to talk about a problem solution approach for understanding OOP concepts. I'll be using C#, I'll be using Visual Studio, and the demonstrations are just going to involve simple designing of the classes. So we are actually not going to go and do much of a logic here. We will just try to understand structuring of classes, interfaces, when do we need overriding, when do we need overloading, when do we use interfaces, abstract classes, and things like that, through which we are going to go and understand a bit of solid principles as well. So in order to understand OOP concepts, let's start with the first problem. So the first problem that we have here is designing an editor. Now, when I say design an editor, you must have heard of editors like Notepad, WordPad, or MS Word. So are we really going to go and design some sort of editor like Notepad? So actually no, we are not going to go and get involved into user interface. We will be rather defining some sort of console application which will simply have some sort of routine formatting functionalities. Now when I say routine formatting functionalities like cut, copy, paste, are we really going to go and work with clipboard? Absolutely no. So we are not going to go and work with clipboard. So imagine we are going to go and have some functionality like cut, copy, paste. We will simply, whenever this functionality gets called, we will print on the console like the data is cut, data is copied, data is pasted. And then when it comes to something like maybe defining a class, we will try to understand why are we writing some class in some X manner only. So not much of a logic, not much of a UI, but simple class designing is what we are going to go and understand. So let's try to understand the problem statement in detail. We need to design a Notepad-like application. Let's call it as an editor. Then, along with the basic functionalities like cut, copy, paste, we also need some unique selling functionality, unique selling point functionality. A USP of a application is going to be spell check. For a spell check, which itself is going to be a complex functionality, which is like involving maybe dictionary or word comparison. Anyway, we are not going to go and do the logic as I said. So we will just try to understand maybe simply by writing some spell check function inside some sort of class. Now when it comes to maybe writing some function, then if we just try to understand the complexity, it can go to complexity like this. So there can be some logic based on top of languages. So in order to support multiple number of languages support specifically for doing a spell check, then we may end up writing multiple spell check functions, or we can think about maybe using some sort of OOP concepts. So next to I can say maybe after we end up writing some basic code, you may have to understand the future needs as well. So future needs can be, we may have to end up maybe adding some new language support as well. And then we need to understand a best system is whenever some sort of new additions happen, if we need to change little less or absolutely nothing at the base layer or at the base logic layer, you'll find out that's the best system that one can design. So here is what we are going to go and do. In order to understand the concepts, let's go for maybe defining a system first. So I'm going to start Visual Studio. I'm going to quickly create a new solution. So all my solutions will be part of, or all my projects in this series will be part of one solution. At the end of the series, I'm going to go and share the entire solution with all of you. So let's call it as maybe demo OOP concepts. So let me get a blank solution. Let's say next. Let's give a name to it as an demo OOP concepts or demo concepts. Let's click on create. So in this project, we don't have any projects as such. Let's add one project. Let's take console application using C#. Let's give a name to it as demo01. So you may try this demonstration in Java or CPP or any object-oriented supporting or object-oriented programming supporting language. So now what we need to do is, as we discussed here, in here, so we need to define an editor which has got some basic functionalities like cut, copy, paste. So cut, copy, paste, if at all we consider it as a function, functions in case of maybe object-oriented programming languages, typically we end up writing inside a classes. So let's do one thing. I'm going to close the program class and I'm going to create one simple class. Let's call it as editor. Let's do one thing. Let's quickly add here certain functionalities. Let's call it as cut, copy, paste. So I'm going to add here a functionality which is like simple cut, then some empty logic here. Then we can always copy paste this logic, cut, copy, paste, and then we can end up writing some basic code like data is cut. Maybe we'll end up writing on a console like maybe cut happened on clipboard or cut done. So it can be any functionality that we can end up writing logic like this, as it's just a demo. So copy done, paste done, and so on. But then are we really going to go and call these functionalities? So understanding that these functionalities exist and we are not going to go and anyway call it, I'm just going to go and focus on spell check functionality. So here's what I'm going to go and do. Instead of wasting our time in cut, copy, paste like functionalities, I'm going to go and go for writing something like spell check functionality. Now, as I said, the editor along with the basic formatting functionalities like cut, copy, paste, we also have something like spell check as well. So imagine a scene. Your editor class has got a public void function. Let's call it as SpellCheck. Now, let's take an example that SpellCheck may expect some sort of string word as in parameter. And as I said, some actual logic will be there here. But then, as we are just learning the designing, I'm going to go and simply put up here on a console something like word is valid or word or spelling is valid. Correct. Now, this seems very simple that as and when there is something called as editor, somebody creates an object of, we can have a spell check called, we can pass the word, and we can simply have something put up on a console like spelling is correct. Imagine this spell check may be called maybe by the user itself in the program class, or maybe internally somewhere automatically whenever the word is put up inside the editor. As I said, we don't have a visual over here. But then, as I said earlier as well, if editor does the spell check and the spell check itself is going to be a complex functionality, just imagine here we can end up writing logic which can be like thousands of lines of code. Now, writing thousands of lines of maybe code inside one single function is not a good idea. Ideally, function sizes, parameters or number of parameters, there are guidelines to it. So one should not just go and maybe write down a bulky function like 1000 lines. We should look for reusability all the time. We should rather break the code into small functions than writing one big giant function with 1000 lines. So instead of creating a God function or a God class which knows almost everything, we are going to go and split the code into n number of functions. So in general, in here, let's say there is a functionality that we have which is simple spell check. Imagine a code, if we just understand it as, if it's an English like language, maybe if it's English, you will have some code. Then maybe if it's some other language, we will have else here, we will have else. If it is, let's say maybe French, we will have again a code. And then ultimately, we will end up writing multiple if-else statements based on the languages that we decide to support. Fair enough. But then when it comes to maybe adding a new language, we will have to end up adding another loop into this existing code itself. Now, which is not a good idea at all. As we discussed earlier, there should be less changes involved into the existing code whenever new changes or new features are going to get piled up. So what's the best option available for us? Best option available is, let's not go and write down all the if-else statements like this over here. As I said, having something like English functionality itself is going to be a big job, because it's going to involve comparing the words with respect to strings, or rather dictionary, French words with respect to French dictionary, and so on. So instead of we writing a huge logic with respect to every language that we know over here, we are going to go and break the spell check functions based on the languages, as language can be one base specifically for spell check or spell comparison. So best options available are here. Here's what we will do. We are not going to go and have the spell check functionality as a part of editor. Editor by default does the formatting and all, so we are okay with it. But since spell check itself is going to be a huge functionality, we are just simply going to go and move this functionality into another class itself. Now why is that? Because if editor is going to go and do the basic functionalities like formatting, spell check, which is a huge functionality in itself, we don't want to burden the editor along with the extra functionality like spell check. So instead of editor knowing how to do spell check along with formatting, we are going to go and move the spell check into a different class altogether. Now, does it mean like we are going to go and offer some sort of unique single functionality to an editor? Absolutely true. We are going to go and offer some sort of formatting related functionalities to editor, and we are going to go and create a separate class specifically for spell checking. So we have a class called as SpellChecker here. Let me spell that correctly. And then we are going to go and have here a function called as SpellCheck. Let's call it as do the check. And then there can be a logic with respect to some word. Now let me take an example here. SpellChecker has do the check. Do the check has some word as in parameter. It's going to go and have a logic which is going to perform some spell check, and it's going to go and print on a console spelling is correct. But then again one more thing. Something like if editor has basic formatting functionalities like cut, maybe copy, and maybe paste like functionalities as we discussed earlier. So let me write down some logic for cut, copy, paste functions. Here, though I'm not going to go and write it. So how are we going to go and maybe associate SpellChecker with respect to editor? As we discussed earlier, here it should have a USB functionality like a spell check. So editor should have a USB functionality of a spell check. So as we already have moved the spell check into some different maybe class, it's like editor needs a spell checker now, which means editor have spell checker, editor has spell checker. So what we need is now we need an object of spell checker inside the editor. Simple containment. So how do I go and maybe use it? So I may go and maybe simply create here a SpellChecker class object. Let's call it as SpellChecker sp is equal to new SpellChecker. Now this class object is, let's say, it's right now available for only internal use. In order to call with editor this do the check functionality, you may end up writing some sort of wrapper function. So imagine a scene if we end up writing some sort of a wrapper, maybe check function. And then inside the wrapper, if we keep on calling sp dot do the check, since do the check needs word, we will take a parameter as in string word, and then that word can be passed on as it is as a parameter. Seems okay. We can simply make this as private, and then we can simply have this as, maybe since it's simple Microsoft coding standard, I may end up adding here underscore to a private member. I may go and maybe add underscore over here as well. And then instead of we creating an object directly, we will initially assign it to null. As and when the constructor gets created, I will use the initialization code. So here, as and when the editor class object gets created, we will have SpellChecker initialized. And the same SpellChecker object will be used internally in a wrapper check function. So, and then it looks like editor has a check functionality, and internally some other classes functionality this wrapper check is going to go and use. Seems all good as of now. So as and when the editor gets called or created, we may go for editor, editor, equal to new editor. So constructor gets called and we will have simple editor dot wrapper check. I'll pass on some word here, maybe XYZ, and then we will just wait on the console so that the window remains open. So let me run this code. If I run this, you will simply see spelling is correct. So it seems it's working, though the actual code does not exist, no UI exists. Now let's address another problem. Another problem is there's a complex logic which is based on top of language, which means this spell checker, if it is doing, let's say, do the check. Let's say the do the check function itself is doing all the check with respect to all the languages. So all languages. Now again, if we try to observe this, there are like n number of languages that we have, and if we have to support most of the languages, just imagine the size of this function. Now it itself is going to be a problem, which means this will be a God function which knows every language spell check feature. So instead of we making this function as a God function, what we can do is we can always go for maybe writing multiple functions. So imagine a scene if we end up writing multiple functions like this, do the spell check 2 and so on. Ultimately, though we will end up writing separate functions for each of the language, the problem will be this class itself will know about every other language feature, which means this class will be a God class which knows almost how to do a spell check with respect to every language, which means we are not supposed to have here a dictionary based logic with respect to language inside one single class. So what's the best option then? Is it that we should define a new class itself? Because if I end up writing with respect to language, all the logic inside a function is going to be something like God function. If I end up writing multiple functions with respect to similar kind of a logic with respect to multiple different dictionaries, you will find out it's going to be a God class. So ultimately what I'm looking for is, I'm looking for no God function writing and no God class writing. The classes should have a single responsibility. Single responsibility actually doesn't mean a single function. It means logically the functionality should relate itself. So ultimately, if the dictionary related functionality, there can be a function here, something like reading a dictionary. There can be a function here which can be maybe comparing a simple word. There can be a dictionary which is like adding a word into, let's say, maybe the language specific class. So instead of we going for like writing only one single function, it's not something like actually we are going to go and write down a single function. So it's like we can end up writing huge number of functions inside a class. The only concern is it looks like only one function I've written here, looks like I have written only one function here. But single responsibility principle doesn't mean you write a single function in a single class. It simply means that logically a group of functionality should exist which represent some sort of maybe a uniqueness in terms of class. So when it comes to maybe spell checker, let's call this spell checker as not spell checker in general. Let's call it as English spell checker. So now we have here English spell checker, which is going to go and perform maybe do the check. Now, what if I copy this and what if I paste it again and put it as French spell checker? So when it comes to public class French spell checker, I again have a function called as do the check. I'll have a word and I'll put up here French spell checking, or maybe word checking is done. I'm just going to go and change the words. I'll again copy this code and put it here and change the word as French to English. So we have English spell checker class, we have French spell checker class. It can have another functions here, it can have many other functions over here, and which can be specifically related to French as in language, it can be specific to English as in language. Now when it comes to maybe writing multiple classes like this, editor was dependent on spell checker. Now obviously it can't be dependent on spell checker because I have got two different classes or number of different classes available with respect to languages now. So how do I make it dependent? Does it mean that we should have here English spell checker, or we should have here maybe another object of French spell checker like this? That way again what will happen is As and when we keep on adding languages, we will have to keep on creating objects like this, and which is like modifying the base itself. As we discussed earlier, any extra feature that you add, there should be less kind of changes with respect to the code we already have written. So the classes that you end up writing is something like those classes should be concrete classes, and then there should be less or zero kind of a code changes getting involved as and when the features get added. So best option to work here with is, I really don't want editor to be dependent on English only. I really don't want editor to be dependent on French only. I don't want even editor to be dependent on English, French and all other languages. So I really want something common out of English and French. So English has do the check function, French also has got do the check function, and these functions are doing the respective jobs of checking in English and checking in French. So can we identify something common out of these two? Yes, we do identify there are functions with the same name that we have. So if the functions exist with the same name and the functionalities differ, which means signature of the function is same but the logic differs, here it's a clear case of, you can say, maybe overriding. Now how do we do that? Does it mean that we should always have English as a base here and maybe French should inherit from English or something? Now that doesn't look good, because French doesn't inherit from English. So languages or language checkers or language as an entity won't inherit from some other language, because maybe if at all there is another checker that we will have like Arabic, because technically speaking it's like French language inherits from English language, or other than that maybe Arabic language inherits from English language. Though I have just given a name as SpellChecker, just imagine language respective functionalities are huge and high and they differ a lot from basic to, you can say, maybe any advanced feature. So here when you put a colon like this, inheritance, it's like French SpellChecker is English SpellChecker. Now this is not true. So ideally whenever you put inheritance between two different classes, what you should understand it as that we always and always have here, or we need to read certain things like French SpellChecker is English SpellChecker. Always read this statement. A class is a B class. So whenever you put inheritance or a colon inside the application, please ensure that you read this and logically it should sound correct. If at all it doesn't sound correct, if at all, suppose example, if I put editor colon maybe SpellChecker, it looks like editor is a SpellChecker. Editor is not a SpellChecker. Editor is simple, maybe notepad like maybe a formatting application. So editor is not a SpellChecker, or English SpellChecker is not editor, or French SpellChecker is not English SpellChecker, and so on. So always try to read the inheritance statement or colon as an is, and then whenever logically when that statements sound correct, keep it. If it doesn't sound correct, then ultimately try to maybe think about it, that where exactly the hierarchy or what kind of a hierarchy one can put up. So when it comes to code again, I really can't go and maybe have French SpellChecker is English SpellChecker kind of a relationship. However, we can always say English SpellChecker and French SpellChecker are simple checkers or simple spell checkers that we can have. So what does it mean is we should ideally go and write another class, let's call it as SpellChecker. And then the SpellChecker can inherit from, now the English SpellChecker can inherit from SpellChecker like this. Now, why are we inheriting even? Because there is nothing written as such over here. So is it not true that both of them, these classes, they have the same function over here? Yeah, I agree. But then how about maybe putting some common functionalities like this? Now, if at all, what do I write here? If at all I end up putting some base functionality like this, so what do I write here? As English is going to go and do its own job, French is going to go and do its own job. So ultimately, there is nothing in the base as such. Maybe there can be some configuration, but then there is nothing in the base as of now that we can identify, we can end up writing here. So in such cases, I am looking for same functionality, maybe to be written, same signature to be written in English, same signature to be copied in French, but logic is going to be different. And then in the base that we have, I really don't see any kind of a basic functionality or common functionality to be written. So in that case, instead of I thinking about what do I write here and putting some sort of words or putting some sort of extra functionality just for the sake of defining a base here, best option is let's not write down a functionality here. But then this is going to be simple function declaration then. If it's a function declaration, best option is let's not define this as a class, let's define this as an interface. And by coding standard, I'm just going to give some prefix here like I. So I SpellChecker is an interface which will be implemented by English SpellChecker and which will be implemented by French SpellChecker. So instead of identifying this as a class, we have identified this as an interface because there is nothing common that we are going to put up. However, if there is any common functionality that we can think about, we can always end up maybe writing this interface and maybe turn this into a class. And then we can always go for maybe writing some common logic. So have you identified some common logic between your classes? If yes, then we can better define a class. If there is nothing, maybe common functionality or logic that we can think about, but then we can think about some sort of functionality signatures, we can always plan to have an interface here. So when it comes to now, something like maybe defining an interface and implementing interface over here, I don't have to do anything extra because we already had it implemented. Now from all these discussions, what does it, what kind of a sense it makes? It makes sense like, it's like we defined, is it that we defined a base first or we defined the derived first? It looks like we had a functionality in the existing class first in the editor. So by looking at the functionality, when we identified that certain functionalities are making editor a god class, a bulky class, we moved logically those functionalities into some separate class. Then when we saw there is a replica which is going to get created, we tried to create a replica. Then we tried to identify something common and then we tried to extract an interface out of it or maybe a class out of it initially. So is the approach for designing classes, is the approach is always top to bottom? Do we identify base classes first or derived classes first? We normally define simple node level classes first. Then we identify something common and then we extract a base out of it. So normally it's always bottom to top kind of approach which is going to go and help you. So if you ever define kind of a, can say, system, always think about some node level classes first. So leaf level classes, I mean to say. Have the leaf level classes defined, identify something common in between them, and then ultimately try to design some sort of base. At first, if it seems like it's a class, define it as a class, as a base class. Later on, you may think about it, something like we can have something called as maybe interfaces, define it as an interface. So how long are you going to go and perform these kind of changes? Which means, are you really going to go and maybe keep on exploring about the base classes? Are you going to go and maybe keep on extracting base classes? When is going to go and end finally? So point to understand here is there is always something called as cooling period for your project you should offer. Which means as an architect, whenever you define some sort of, you can say, classes, define the leaf level classes first, identify something common. Whenever you think of like maybe changing the base level changes, keep it in mind, people are yet to code. Keep it in mind that changes are yet to occur, maybe at a base layer itself. Have you ever thought of, if there are some base classes already defined in your project, what if somebody makes a big change in the base class? What cost is going to get, it's going to go and we have involved? If the base class changes, just imagine most of your derived classes are also going to go and have an impact. So if there are hundreds of different derived classes that you have, those 100 classes are going to go and have n number of changes to be done, or changes which maybe fail the code, maybe code will not build, maybe there will be bugs, maybe there is some sort of maybe kind of, you can say, logical errors, or some sort of, you can say, maybe compile errors, runtime errors. N number of things can happen. So that's the reason people don't do changes at a base layer. So whenever you go for defining some base classes, you have to be very, very careful. So how do architects define it then? They don't actually go and define it overnight. So it's like you as an architect, you may define some leaf level classes first, identify something common between the classes, then define those as interfaces or classes based on your need. If you ever think of like after maybe 10 days that this is not working for you, you can always go and maybe change the base classes. But as I said, then that will never be enough. there will be always time wherein you will think about like, I should have added something in the base class. So define a cooling period for your project. So within the cooling period of a project, which is a typical term, you will find out normally based on your number of lines of code which you're going to expect a person to write down or a project to have, you can decide a cooling period of maybe 2 months to 6 months. And within the cooling period of 2 months to 6 months, what an architect can do is can very well go and maybe define some sort of maybe best base classes layers as in design. So is this something that you see in your front right now? Is this something which is maybe best? No, because we just have defined it. So we have English and we have maybe French SpellChecker as in classes defined. We extracted an interface out of it. And now instead of we making editor dependent on English SpellChecker, I am going to go and make it dependent on iSpellChecker. So I can't declare an object of iSpellChecker, so I'm just going to go and have a declaration like this. I can't actually go and maybe define a SpellChecker like this. So I have to actually provide some default functionality. So I may plan to have here English SpellChecker. So editor is dependent on iSpellChecker. Consider it as any SpellChecker. And then that any SpellChecker in a default constructor, I'm going to go and assign it to English SpellChecker. Hold on then. Does it not mean that whenever I'll create an editor class object, I'll always have this constructor called and I will always have English SpellChecker, which will be like, this functionality will be called from an English SpellChecker? Yes, obviously, because if you look at it, default functionality is something which is expected in the problem statement. So if you look at here, a language support should be offered as a choice along with default language, the last part, the last statement, which means we are really looking for some default language support as well. So let's call the default language as an English language. Okay, but how do I go and maybe make a change? What if somebody doesn't need English? What if somebody needs something like French? Is it that I have to go and perform a change here? No, absolutely no. So we should be able to provide a feature to the end user or a user of this editor class that he or she should be able to set up a value for this iSpellChecker. So here is what we are going to go and do. Instead of we only making it private, it should be externally allowed, or it should be allowed to set up externally. In the sense, we will plan to have here so-called maybe a getter setter. So instead of we making it as private iSpellChecker SP, I'm going to go and change this or rename this as underscore SpellChecker. So I'm going to go and rename this as underscore SpellChecker. And then instead of we simply making this as a private member and initializing it hard-coded way, let's go and maybe have here a property defined. So I just have defined a property here, public iSpellChecker type property called a SpellChecker, which will have simple getter and setter. So it's a lambda expression syntax, which is just going to go and maybe set the value, or it's just going to go and get the value. Are we really interested in getting the value? Absolutely no. I am interested in only and only setting the value. So I'm just going to go and have it as write only property. And then this SpellChecker is something which I am going to go and maybe use now. So we have here SpellChecker. So cannot be used because it has a get accessor. Okay. And then in here, instead of making it usage of property, I'm just going to go and use here SpellChecker. So I believe SpellChecker S was small. Yeah. So what we have here is, let me put it again. So it's like we have a private member of type iSpellChecker. We can't initialize it equal to like new iSpellChecker. So I'm going to go on read this statement for you. French SpellChecker is iSpellChecker. Ultimately it is like it implements, but then just for the sake of reading this word, I may read it as French SpellChecker is of type iSpellChecker. English SpellChecker is of type iSpellChecker. And then editor needs an object of type iSpellChecker. So editor needs iSpellChecker or SpellChecker kind of object. So somebody can always go and maybe set the SpellChecker externally because it is public member right now. So somebody creates the object of SpellChecker, sorry, editor. If you call it directly, it's going to be initialization. Like since you initialize editor here, what if you don't use this property at all? We still have English SpellChecker assigned here. So let's run this. English word checking is done, is what you see on your screen. Next, what if we plan to use something different. So what if I use editor dot, I have a property here called a SpellChecker. And what if I initialize it to French SpellChecker? Just understand this. You'll find out French word checking is done, which means if you don't pass the SpellChecker object of some language, we are anyway going to use English SpellChecker. In case you are looking for some different language SpellChecker, you just have to assign the object of it to the SpellChecker property. Then can we get an existing SpellChecker? I have specifically denied the get property. So you can only set the SpellChecker. I'm not going to go and get the SpellChecker out of this existing editor. So ultimately what we can do is, if somebody really want to extend the language support, somebody can very well go and maybe get this interface, implement the interface, write down his or her own functionality in the specific language SpellChecker, and can very well pass on that language SpellChecker over here. So ultimately we made our editor class maybe full of basic cut, copy, paste or formatting functionalities. We provided spell check functionality to the editor, which is using wrapper check. Internally, editor is using the spell checker functionality, but then since the spell checker functionality itself is a huge kind of frequency job, we have made it available in a respective classes like English and classes like French, and they can be classes like this, like number of classes one can write down. And then just to identify maybe something common, we identified an interface here, a bottom top approach, and then we made editor dependent on iSpellChecker instead of making it dependent on a specific kind of spell checker. Why did I initialize English SpellChecker here? Because I really wanted something default to be available with the object of SpellChecker, because my code is directly dependent on SpellChecker right now. So editor has wrapper check. Wrapper check is dependent on SpellChecker. I don't want the wrapper check to fail. That's the reason SpellChecker must be initialized to something. So we have a SpellChecker initialized to something like this. So ultimately I should have here define it like this. So SpellChecker is equal to new English SpellChecker, that way. So either you assign it externally or you assign it in the constructor as English SpellChecker. So it's very simple to define maybe functionalities like this. So in order to understand what we have achieved, we have seen containment. So something like editor has a SpellChecker. Editor is dependent or was dependent on English SpellChecker. We made it independent of specific SpellChecker by announcing a concept called as interface. So technically editor is dependent on SpellChecker but not a specific SpellChecker. It can be any SpellChecker that you would like to assign from external to the editor. So is it not true that there was a dependency here some time back, which means I had here English SpellChecker, if you recall. So there was a dependency on particular class, and then we removed that dependency by announcing a concept called as interface or some sort of base class. Yes. So technically editor is dependent on some interface, and the interface needs to be used within the application or within the editor only by assigning some class object, which is of type either English or French or Arabic or anything else for that matter. So we just try to resolve the dependency as well. So how did we resolve this dependency? As I said, by simply having an interface. Then how are we resolving this dependency? How is the interface getting the object assigned? Interface is getting object assigned either directly in the constructor itself, or interface is getting the object assigned through the getter setter, which means there was a dependency on a particular class. We resolve the dependency by introducing a concept here called as interface, and then that interface is going to go and get an object assigned either in a constructor or in a getter setter. It is actually call it as dependency injection. So when we expect this English SpellChecker, one can very well plan to do something like this. We can expect maybe a SpellChecker object, and then we can very well maybe pass on this English SpellChecker as a default. So imagine a scene, whenever editor gets created, object gets created, you will have to compulsorily pass on the object of a class here, which is implementing iSpellChecker, and then whatever you pass on as an object, that will be assigned over here. Now the problem will be something like, whenever editor object gets created, let's take an example here. Suppose editor class object gets created. Now the problem is you can't actually go and create an editor object using default constructor because there is no default constructor. And then we will have to pass on here a new object of type English spell checker, for example, because what is expected here is object of type class which implements SpellChecker. So will this work? It should work as it is. Now the problem is we are too much of, you can say, maybe having dependency here, that is some or other class object we should pass which implements SpellChecker. What if I pass on null over here? What if I'm looking for basic formatting functionalities like something like maybe only cut, copy, paste? Okay, if you pass on null here and by any chance if you call a wrapper check, we are going to end up in an exception here, which is going to be object reference not set to instance of an object, because here SpellChecker itself is not assigned because we are expecting assignment in the constructor itself. Now that's the problem. So we really want to think about it. That is, are we really going to go and put a constructor level dependency? Which means, are we really going to go and solve the dependency by injecting some sort of, you can say, class object at a constructor level? It's too, you can say, risky to have a constructor level dependency like this. What if somebody passes null? Obviously, you can put a check here. That is, if the checker equal null, we can always assign English to it. But then people may be a little hesitant towards maybe passing some parameter in the editor. Then what can be done? How about having an overloaded constructor here? So what if I end up writing editor, another constructor? What if I assign here some default which anyway we plan to give to the end user? So what if I provide here English spell checker as in default? Okay, then why will I ever call this? In case you call it and you want to pass on some sort of class object, you are free to basically maybe pass anything you want. If you are not very sure, you can always plan to call a kind of, you can say, maybe default constructor. So in that case, what we can plan is you can always have maybe default called. In the default, whenever default gets called, you may plan to call the other constructor, which can be this, and you can call by passing new English spell checker. So it's like one constructor is trying to call another constructor and we are going to pass on English spell checker over here. So instead of we assigning it over here like this, you pass English spell checker. So anyway, this checker is always going to get a value and then we will always have a checker assigned. So I need not do this kind of, you can say, job over here. So it's like you call default and default is going to give a call to parameterized. That way, this can be one option in case you are looking for calling free editor, default constructor or a parameterized constructor. If you yourself call parameterized constructor, we will anyway have any spell checker passed here. So a constructor level dependency, maybe injection, and then in case you are calling a default constructor, anyway we are calling the parameterized constructor by passing English spell checker by ourselves. Fair enough. And here, in case you are calling default and then later on you think about like I should pass on some sort of other spell checker, we can always have a property level, so-called, or getter setter level, maybe dependency injection over here. So typically there are two different types of dependency injections that we can have. One is constructor level dependency injection and we can have a getter setter or a property level dependency injection. They can be function level too, but since getter setter itself is a function, so you can very well figure that out. So how are we going to work with it now? So I'm not going to pass on null here. If I don't have anything, I'll better call a default constructor. So if I run this, you'll find out we will anyway get the English language spell check done. How did it work? Let's put a breakpoint here and try to understand step by step. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I'll put a breakpoint here. I'll also put a breakpoint here, and that way we'll have all the assignments done. Okay, so let's run this now. So I'm calling editor. Let me close the other debugging tabs. Let me maximize this in size and then editor. So whenever editor default constructor gets called, we are calling default constructor. Default constructor is going to give a call to parameterized constructor. Keep it in mind, line number 29 is yet to execute. So it did go to line number 31. It gets the spell checker. You can check here that there is a English spell checker object passed here. You will assign that to spell checker. It will be completing line 34 and now it will jump to line number 29, which means before even the default constructor completes its execution, parameterize is going to get called by having a hard-coded parameter like English spell checker, and then we will be assigning it. Now that editor has English spell checker object, and wrapper check is going to go and call that English spell checker specific do check function now. So we'll call it. It goes to English spell checker. We'll have that word passed as an XYZ. We'll put on the console English word checking is done, and then we will have waiting on the console. Now, what if I try to inject something by passing parameter to the parameterized constructor? Let's add in here maybe French spell checker. So what will happen now if at all we do something like this? So technically you have specifically said here, that is, I am looking for editor's parameterized function or parameterized constructor to be called. Have a look now. If you call this, you are calling editor with a French spell checker, it will directly go to the editor constructor with a parameter. It did not hit here at all. So you initialize it, done. You have a wrapper check called, and then we are done with the wrapper check functionality being called. So you'll find out French word checking is done. It did not hit the default constructor because you never called one that way. So ideally, you may call default constructor, you may call parameterized constructor. Obviously, what you can plan to do is, instead of you checking or instead of you collecting the spell checker directly here, you can always put a check here if checker is equals null. In case you pass me something which is null, then what I'm going to do, if it is not null, then I'll assign it. Or, so if it is not null, I'll assign it. Else case, I'm going to initialize it to anyway new English spell checker by myself. So in any way, we have actually tried to identify that spell checker never gets a null value. Whether you call a default constructor, whether you call a parameterized constructor, or that way one can very well do that check using the set as well. So I did not write the set function, it is like auto-generated, but one can very well end up writing set function, and inside the set one can very well have a check. If the value equals null, one can very well have here assignment of new English spell checker in a hard-coded way, as the default language check we will be offering along with the editor is English spell checker. Okay, fair enough. So we have dependency injection at a constructor level, we have dependency injection done at the getter setter level, and we have just identified some sort of, you can say, basic problems, maybe solution in terms of single responsibility principle, identifying base classes or interfaces. We identified something called as having bottom up kind of, you can say, approach while designing the system. Now there's one more thing that one can do. What if I am just going to go and play with multiple number of languages while I do the spell check? So one option can be there. I may end up writing here a class. Let's call it as a spell check or a language factory. So instead of we maybe assigning English or French or any other language for that matter, what if I would like to return something here, maybe get spell checker as in one function. So imagine a scene. I have here for time being some choice, and then if the choice passed is equals 1, I would like to return from here a new object of type English spell checker. What if in case 2 I would like to return a new maybe French spell checker? So I'm trying to return sometimes English spell checker, sometimes French spell checker. So what should be my return type over here? Is there anything common between these two? Yes. And the common that we are returning is iSpellChecker. So I'm trying to return the implementation of English iSpellChecker from English SpellChecker and French SpellChecker. And this can be a list which can grow. There can be multiple if else or switch case that we can have, and we can keep on returning multiple number of contents. So where am I going to go and use this language factory in the first place? Imagine a scene, if at all we have a situation like this. I'm going to go and create a factory object. So factory equal to new language factory, and then instead of we actually maybe hard coding a language checker like this, what if the factory returns it to us? Which means, what if I call it as factory some checker equal to, I'll call factory dot get spell checker. And since I need a choice here, I can pass on the choice to the end user, like 1 means English language and 2 means French language. And whichever object that you actually maybe pass on here, you just expect a return from user. Let's say integer choice is equal to convert dot to int32, and we can simply pass on or read from a user something like read line over here. And then whatever is the choice, we'll pass it on to this factory. Just imagine a scene. So I just created a language spell checker factory. I'll take the user input, and whatever is the input, I'll pass it on to the get spell checker. Get spell checker will return me some sort of object of iSpellChecker, which in turn I will pass it on to some checker, to editor. Just imagine a scene now. Run this, have a look. I'm yet to provide a breakpoint at get spell checker. Please have a look. So language factory object gets created. You print something on the console and you wait for user's input. There is something put up. Okay, I believe I have to compile or recompile this and try again. So run again. So I'm going to expect some input from a user. So are you looking for English language spell check or French language spell check? I'll say French language spell check. I'll pass on 2 here. And then I'm going to give a call to factory here. So if I pass on 2 to the factory, this is a parameter that we have received. If the choice is equals to, I'll be returning a new French spell checker object. So instead of hard coding the spell checker, which was sometime back, it was hard coded here as a new English spell checker or French spell checker. Now what I'm trying to do is I'm to get it from some sort of other class. So now I have a factory class whose responsibility is to return some sort of other class objects. So that way, we just try to understand few concepts in this demonstration. So I'm just going to go and maybe club all these classes that we have here. So we actually wanted a very simple functionality. If you understand it well, I have not written a single kind of, you can say, right, maybe a logic specifically with respect to spell check. I have not written cut, copy, paste, or maybe things with respect to maybe clipboard. But then we just try to understand how to define the classes, identify interfaces, how do we structure those, and maybe at a very basic level, just try to understand, or ground level, understand IOC or a factory concept. So if we go back to problem 1 solution, the takeaway from this demonstration is we try to understand what exactly factory class is. We just try to understand single responsibility principle, which means a class or entity should have a single responsibility. Single responsibility doesn't mean that single function. Single responsibility means a kind of, you can say, logically group of functionalities can exist, but then logically it should have a unique kind of, you can say, goal set. When I say open close principle, though I did not talk about it, open close principle, it's like the class should be open for maybe extension, but should be closed for modification, which means we just try to identify a base interface. In this case, we just try to write down some sort of, you can say, base interface. We did not, whenever some change comes up, whenever new language comes up, we won't be actually going and modifying maybe English spell checker or Hindi spell checker or maybe French spell checker. Rather, we will be defining a new class by keeping something as a base. In this case, it's an interface, but in the next example, we will try to understand open close principle in more depth. The next thing we try to understand is dependency injection. So we try to do the dependency injection using two different ways. One is using a constructor and one is using a getter, setter, or a property. And then we just try to understand IOC at a very basic stage. So in detail, we will try to discuss about it more maybe in the upcoming demonstrations. And then we also try to understand simple hazard relationship. It's always better that you always try to read the classes whenever there is a hierarchy. So whenever there is a colon put up, try to read the first class is the second class. And if logically that sounds correct, then keep it. If logically it doesn't sound correct at all, there is something missing definitely. At any point of time, if you're trying to simple copy paste the functionality, for example, there was a functionality with respect to English. I simply tried to copy it and paste it inside a French kind of, you can say, class. So point is, whenever you try to do a copy paste, there is something which is not right there. If you copy paste, which means there is a better way of doing it. So we just try to identify why did I copy. I copied because I really wanted a signature. But was I looking for the actual logic? Absolutely no. I was not looking for a logic. I was looking for simple signature. So is it a signature I'm looking for, or is it a functionality I'm looking for? If I'm looking for functionality, it's better to define a base class and put that common functionality in a base class. Am I looking for only signatures? Better you define an abstract class or interface. So why did not I define here abstract class? Why did I define interface? Because there was nothing common logic as such that I was looking for. If you're looking for common logic and simple, maybe declarations as well along with it, it's better you go with abstract classes. Are you looking for something like maybe only declarations? Go for interface. Are you looking for only common functionalities? Go for abstract class. So based on the need, you will maybe understand it. So by practice, you'll be able to define better and better classes. So in the first problem statement, we just try to understand these many things. In the second problem statement, we are going to understand these things plus something more. So interface and abstract class, anyway, we will revisit this in the next discussion. So next feature, we are going to understand a report builder. So I'm going to pause here this session and then we will revisit in the next session.